So when Rob first asked me to talk about trauma and then sent an addendum email saying 10 minutes, firstly I was relieved that it's only 10 minutes. Unlike the other people who have shared today, I'm not used to speaking in front of loads of people unless I'm talking about something medical, in which case hopefully I know more about it than most of them in the room. Trauma, I don't think that I know any more than any of you. I don't think any of us do. So I'm actually just going to share a bit of my experience. And as some of you know, I qualified as a doctor 5 years ago. And I've spent just under half of the time since then working in developing and humanitarian context. And last year I've one slide, if you could throw it up there for me. So I spent most of 2011 working with Doctors Without Borders in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is right about there where it says poverty and disease. And I was working with a humanitarian aid organization there, and I just wanted to share with you some of the things that were stirred up in me in the midst of all the trauma and suffering that I saw while I was there. We all know that we live in a world full of suffering. You may know that 1 billion of the world's 2.2 billion children live in poverty, that 40 million people are living with HIV and there are 15 million AIDS orphans, that 85 million people were affected by natural disasters in 2011 alone, that mass rape is one of the most effective weapons of war, that torture is on the rise, that unemployment is as high as it's ever been in Europe since the introduction of the euro, that depression is on the rise, suicide, it goes on and on and on. But sometimes I wonder if the world hides behind some of our facts and figures rather than embracing the people who make up those numbers. And the numbers are so sterile, yet the trauma and the suffering behind them is really messy and really dirty, and sometimes I feel like we hide behind those numbers and we don't let ourselves see what's really behind them. And so I kind of wanted to look for a few minutes today about what I think our role in that is as Christians, as friends, daughters, parents, partners, and just as citizens of this world. And that was a question that came up for me time and again while I was in Congo and in my working and home life here. And I wanted to just tell you about one of those times when that question was raised. And it was last August when I met Wilanje, who's there bottom left, who, and I really don't want to tug on anyone's heartstrings telling the cliche story of a suffering Black African child, but unfortunately that's actually the reality of it. So I met Wilanje last August in Congo. He was a patient for 2 or 3 weeks in hospital, so I got to know himself and his father and his 10 brothers and sisters. And he had come in to us in bad heart failure, and I won't go into the pathology of it, but basically that was something that could have killed him, and he actually ended up doing really well and going home well. And I came to work one morning in September to be told that he had come back in during the night and was very unwell and was in intensive care. And don't start picturing any machines or tubes or anything. Any of you who've been in intensive care units here, what that meant for us was literally that you could give the child oxygen. So I went straight down to see him and knew immediately when I saw him that this child was dying. But what was even more striking about it was the realization that he knew that he was dying. And the desperation on his face, but also the flicker of hope that maybe the Mzungu doctor could do something for him. And of course, I couldn't. All I could do was sit with him for the few hours until he died that afternoon. And in those few hours, I really started thinking, what on earth is my role here? I mean, I didn't go to Congo, and I don't do my job here thinking that you're going to cure everyone. You're just not, and I'm not that naive. And I had kind of gone out thinking, okay, so I can give the best medical care that I have to offer. And a second part of it, which I think is just as important, is I'm here to be a witness to the trauma and suffering that these people are experiencing and to be an advocate for people who don't have a voice. And I actually think that is a responsibility that all of us have. All of us who have a voice have a responsibility to speak up against the atrocities that are happening in the world that other people cannot save themselves from. But I realized in those few hours with Wilanje that our role is even more than that, and it is to just be with people in their suffering and to offer ourselves when we don't feel we have a solution or a cure, and to just offer our presence. And so that was one of 3 kind of key words that I did put up there, was presence. How many times did God tell us in the Bible, I am with you? I'm with you until the end of time. Fear not, for I am with you always. I am with you and will watch over you. I am with you heart and soul. Again and again. And he never promised that it was going to be easy. He didn't promise our paths would be straight, quite the opposite. But he did promise that he would be with us. And that is something that we can then offer to people who are suffering. We can be with them in that suffering. We can show them that they're not forgotten, that all those anonymous people who make up those facts and figures are not anonymous and are not forgotten. And in fact, when I left Congo, one of the things that most people thanked me for wasn't for medical care or for this life saved. It was for living with them and for being with them and for crying with them and for just being there. The other two words that I put up there were privilege and hope. And often I think we run away from trauma and suffering because we don't know what to say, we don't know what to do, we don't know what we have to offer. But we should consider it such a privilege when people let us into their suffering and their trauma and they let us experience and live that with them. And see it for the opportunity it is to bring hope. And as it says in Romans 5, we rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. And so what's the result of all of this? Well, I think that God becomes visible in a tangible way when we reach out to people who suffer. And I read this put so beautifully recently, saying that when we reach out to people who suffer, we meet God soul to soul and face to face. And so if we really open our eyes and let that suffering and that trauma impact us and let it shape us without letting it steal our joy, without getting desensitized to it, but really let it shape us, in this way we become more accessible to people around us and we become channels through which God can comfort others and thus comfort us as well. And one of the things I prayed before leaving for Congo, and especially in my first few days there, which were very traumatic for me, being faced with vicious tortures, mass rapes, just things that even in other settings I'd worked in, I'd never encountered things like that. And I just really prayed, Father, do not let me become hardened. Keep my eyes open to the reality of what I'm seeing. And in retrospect, I can only say that that prayer must have been put there by God himself. But I think the ultimate goal of this is a freedom for us, a freedom in the awareness that we don't have to hide or run away from our pain or the pain of others, but that in fact, it can bring us closer to each other and closer to God, and thus it can be life-giving. Someone translated a beautiful Spanish prayer for me recently that said, Father, do not take us away from the big waves, but free us from the fear that inhibits us. And I actually saw some of this freedom in the Congolese people that I lived and worked with, who they weren't running from their fears. Yes, they were running from the bullets that were chasing them, but they weren't hiding from the fact of their situation, and they were letting both their joy and their suffering shape them in equal measure. And this meant that on days where there would be a skirmish in the streets and we'd all try to find some hard wall to hide behind, people would come back out onto the deserted streets when the gunshots died down and turn back on the music and start dancing. And if that isn't freedom, well, I don't know what is. So I guess in closing, I just wanted to remind us all to keep our eyes open to what is around us, to not turn our backs when we feel like we don't have anything to offer, and to offer ourselves. And I just wanted to close with a quote from author Henry Nouwen, who said, "Still, when we honestly asked ourselves which persons in our lives mean the most to us, we often find that it's those who, instead of giving much advice, solutions or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a gentle and tender hand. The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in any hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. That is the friend who cares. Are we willing to not run away from the pain, to not get busy when there is nothing to do, and instead stand in the face of death together with those who grieve?" Thanks.